Did you know that during the Second World War, the average person in Britain became healthier than they had ever been before? It sounds impossible. It was a time of bombings, fear, and severe food shortages. Yet, death rates from diseases linked to poor diet went down. How could less food lead to better health? And what did it mean to eat an egg once a week if you were lucky? Or to see a banana for the first time when you were 10 years old? The war wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was fought in every kitchen, in every garden plot, and on every dinner plate. A generation's relationship with food was completely rewired. It was a war on waste. It was a crash course in nutrition. It was a lesson in making something from nothing. This wasn't about fancy recipes, it was about survival. And the habits forged in those years of scarcity didn't just disappear when the war ended, they echoed for decades, shaping how families ate, shopped, and thought about the food on their plates. What happens to a society when a carrot is a treat and fat is a strategic resource? Let's look at the ways rationing changed everything. Number 16, could you really make a meal from scraps? It sounds like a myth, a story grandmothers tell, making a meal from things we throw away today without a second thought. But during the war, it wasn't a story, it was a daily reality. The concept of waste, as we know it, simply ceased to exist. Every crumb, every peel, every bone had potential. This wasn't just about being frugal, it was a patriotic duty. The British Ministry of Food, led for a time by the savvy Lord Woolton, launched massive campaigns with slogans like "What's not, want not." Posters showed cartoons of potatoes with sad faces begging not to be peeled too thickly. They weren't just suggestions. They were part of the national strategy. Take potato peelings. Today, they go straight into the compost or the bin. Back then, they were washed, sometimes lightly salted, and baked until crisp. It was a snack. It was sustenance. Stale bread was another treasure. It was never, ever thrown out. It was grated to make breadcrumbs for coating fish or bulking up meat patties. It was soaked in milk and eggs if you had them to make bread pudding. It was the foundation of countless recipes designed to stretch a meal. The water you boil vegetables in, that was called pot liquor, and it was saved. It was full of vitamins, they said. So it became the base for soups and gravies. Nothing was wasted. The government even organized the collection of kitchen scraps on a national scale. Bins were put out on streets for pig food. People would dutifully deposit their vegetable peelings, plate scrapings, and anything else that couldn't be eaten by humans. This collection system fed millions of pigs, which in turn provided a crucial source of meat. It was a closed loop of national recycling, born from pure necessity. In 1943, it was estimated that this scrap collection was enough to feed 250,000 pigs, producing enough bacon for millions of people. Even fat was a strategic resource. Dripping from a roast, bacon grease, any kind of cooking fat was carefully collected in a jar by the stove. It was used for cooking again and again, and when it was truly spent, it wasn't thrown away. Households were asked to salvage their waste fats. It would be collected and processed to extract glycerin. Glycerin was a key component in making explosives. The fat from your Sunday roast could, quite literally, become part of the war effort. This reality was promoted by home economists like Marguerite Patton, whose radio shows and pamphlets reached millions. She wasn't just giving recipes, she was teaching a new way of thinking, where every scrap had a purpose. She demonstrated how to make savory tarts using leftover vegetables and a pastry made with mashed potatoes instead of precious flour and fat. This mindset seeped into the very fabric of cooking. Bones from a meat joint would be boiled for hours, even days, to make a thin but useful stock. The stock would be used for soup, and then the bones might be broken up and boiled again. Only when they were completely devoid of any flavor or gelatin would they be discarded. This nose-to-tail, root-to-leaf approach wasn't a trendy culinary movement, it was the only way to get by. It required immense creativity and a complete re-evaluation of what was considered food. The generation that lived through this learned a lesson in resourcefulness that many carried with them for the rest of their lives. For them, throwing food away felt like a moral failing. But what do we really know about the long-term psychological impact of this? Did the constant pressure to save every scrap create a lifetime of food-related anxiety for some? How many ingenious, unwritten recipes, created by desperate housewives in their kitchens, have been lost to time forever? And while we know pot liquor contained vitamins, what was the true nutritional trade-off of a diet so heavily supplemented with what we would now consider garbage? Of number 15, did a garden in the backyard truly feed a family? The idea seems so simple, so wholesome, a family digging up their lawn to plant potatoes and cabbages. But the Victory Garden movement was one of the largest civilian mobilizations of the entire war. In Britain, it was called the Dig for Victory campaign, launched in 1939. In the United States, the Department of Agriculture pushed a similar program. This wasn't a suggestion for a weekend hobby. It was a critical part of the national food strategy. With enemy submarines sinking supply ships, importing food became dangerous and unreliable. The solution was to turn every available patch of soil into a miniature farm. And they did. Lawns, flower beds, public parks, the grounds of the Tower of London, even sports fields were dug up and converted into vegetable plots. In the US, it was estimated that by 1944, nearly 20 million Victory Gardens were active. These gardens, planted in backyards and community plots, produced an astonishing amount of food. Some reports claim they were responsible for over 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed in the country during the peak years. The government supported this with a massive propaganda effort. Pamphlets were printed with detailed instructions on how to plant, what to grow, and how to combat pests. Characters like Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete appeared in cartoons, encouraging children to eat their vegetables. This wasn't easy work. Many of the people digging these plots were office workers, factory laborers, and housewives who had never gardened before. They learned through trial and error through pamphlets and through their neighbors. The focus was on high yield, calorie dense, and easy to store crops. Potatoes were king. They were easy to grow and incredibly versatile. Carrots, cabbages, onions, leeks, and beans were also staples. These weren't fancy gardens. They were practical, productive plots of land dedicated to one purpose: feeding a family. The impact was more than just nutritional. It was a huge morale booster. Tending a garden was something tangible a person could do to contribute to the war effort. It gave people a sense of control and purpose in a world that felt chaotic and terrifying. A successful harvest was a victory in itself. It also fostered a sense of community. Neighbors shared seeds, tools, and advice. They traded surplus beans for potatoes. Gardening became a social activity, a shared struggle against weeds, pests, and bad weather. For children, it was an education. They learned where food came from, not from a shop, but from the earth. The historian and author Jane Fernley Whittingstall documented in her book The Ministry of Food how this movement transformed the British landscape and diet. But it wasn't a perfect solution. A family couldn't survive on vegetables alone. The gardens provided essential vitamins in bulk, but not the fats and proteins that were so heavily rationed. And success was not guaranteed. A bout of potato blight, an infestation of cabbage moths, or a dry summer could wipe out a family's hard work. Still, the sheer scale of the movement was incredible. It fundamentally changed the urban and suburban landscape, turning manicured lawns into productive plots. It connected millions of people to their food source in a way they never had been before. Yet, crucial questions remain. How much of the reported output from these gardens was accurate, and how much was wartime propaganda designed to boost morale? What was the long-term ecological impact of millions of amateur gardeners suddenly using pesticides and altering local soil composition on a massive scale? And when the war ended and lawns were reseeded, what knowledge about self-sufficiency was lost, perhaps permanently? Number 14. When sugar vanished, what satisfied the sweet tooth? For most people today, a life with almost no sugar is unimaginable. It's in everything. But during the war, sugar was one of the first and most severely rationed commodities. In Britain, the weekly ration dropped to just 8 ounces per person and sometimes less. That had to cover everything sugar for tea and coffee, for baking, for making jam. A single modern can of soda can contain more sugar than a person's entire weekly allowance. This scarcity forced a complete reinvention of what it meant for something to be sweet. The national sweet tooth didn't just disappear. It had to be satisfied with other things. Carrots became a surprising hero. They are naturally sweet, especially when cooked. The government actively promoted this. Lord Woolton himself was a proponent of the Woolton pie, a vegetable pie that often had a sweetish flavor from root vegetables. But carrots also became a dessert ingredient. There were recipes for carrot pudding, carrot cake, and even a sort of carrot fudge. The idea was to grate carrots very finely and use their natural sweetness and moisture to replace some of the sugar and fat in a recipe. Beetroot, another naturally sweet root vegetable, was used in the same way. People experimented with anything they could find. Saccharin, an artificial sweetener, became a household staple. It had been around for decades, but was never hugely popular due to its slightly bitter aftertaste. During the war, people got used to it. A single saccharin tablet in a cup of tea was the daily reality for millions. Honey was available, but it was also scarce and expensive. For those lucky enough to have space for a beehive or know someone who did, honey was like liquid gold. Children, in particular, felt the sugar shortage keenly. The sweet ration was tiny, often just a few ounces a week. This meant that a small bar of chocolate or a few boiled sweets had to last for days. Stories abound of children licking their sweets to make them last longer, or carefully cutting a chocolate bar into 7 tiny pieces, one for each day of the week. The lack of sugar also meant that traditional treats like birthday cakes became major projects. A cake might be made with grated carrot or mashed potatoes to provide bulk and moisture. The icing might be a thin glaze or simply a dusting of what little sugar was available. This had a profound impact on the palate of a generation. They grew up in a world that was not overwhelmingly sweet. The subtle, earthy sweetness of a carrot was a genuine treat. Their taste buds were not conditioned to expect the high levels of sugar common in modern diets. When American GIs arrived in Britain with their chocolate bars and chewing gum, it was a revelation for many British children. Those items became a form of currency, a taste of a different, more abundant world. The food writer and historian B. Wilson has written about how this period of sugar scarcity may have had unintended health benefits, contributing to lower rates of dental decay and obesity. But how did this forced adaptation of the palate affect long-term food preferences? Did the generation raised on carrot pudding develop a permanent aversion to overly sweet foods, or did it create a pent-up demand that exploded after the war? What were the unknown health consequences of the widespread long-term consumption of saccharin by an entire population? And how much of the black market economy was driven not by essentials, but by the simple, powerful human craving for sugar? Number 13, how did they eat the whole animal? Bones and all. Today, we are used to buying meat in neat plastic wrapped packages, a chicken breast, a pork chop, a pound of ground beef. We are far removed from the animal itself. During the war, this was a luxury nobody could afford. The meat ration was incredibly small. In Britain, it was based on price, not weight. Which meant you got very little for your coupons. The average was about 1 shilling and 2 pence worth of meat per person per week. That equated to roughly 1 pound of the cheapest cuts. This scarcity forced a return to older, more resourceful ways of eating. It meant using every single part of the animal. This was the birth of nose-to-tail eating, not as a foodie trend, but as a basic survival strategy. Offal, the internal organs of an animal, became a dietary staple. Before the war, things like liver, kidneys, heart, and tripe were often considered food for the poor or for pets. During the war, they became essential. They were cheap, protein-rich, and off-ration, meaning they didn't require precious coupons. The Ministry of Food published pamphlets with recipes for steak and kidney pie, with very little steak, braised heart, and stewed tripe. These dishes, while unfamiliar to some, were a lifeline. They provided iron and essential nutrients that were hard to get elsewhere. Dr. Elsie Widdowson and Dr. Robert McCants, 2 pioneering nutritionists who did extensive research during this period, noted the high nutritional value of these forgotten cuts. It went beyond just the main organs. Pigs' trotters were boiled to make gelatinous stocks or jellied dishes. A sheep's head could be boiled for hours to make a nourishing broth, with the meat from the cheeks and tongue carefully picked off. Blood was used to make black pudding. Even the bones were a critical resource. As mentioned before, they were boiled repeatedly for stock. But some people went further. There were suggestions, though it's unclear how widespread the practice was, to bake bones until they were brittle and then grind them into a powder to be added to soups or breads for extra calcium. This approach required a different set of skills in the kitchen. Housewives had to learn how to prepare these unusual cuts. They had to learn how to render fat from suet, how to slow cook tough pieces of meat until they were tender, and how to make a small amount of meat feed a large family. This was often done by bulking out dishes with vegetables, especially potatoes and carrots, from the Victory Garden, and by creating thick, savory gravies to carry the flavor. A dish, like a meatloaf, wasn't just meat. It was meat, breadcrumbs made from stale crusts, grated vegetables, and perhaps an onion. It was a masterpiece of extension. This experience had a lasting effect. For many who lived through it, the idea of wasting any part of an animal became unthinkable. They had learned the value of every morsel. However, it also created a division. When the war ended and prime cuts of meat became available again, many people embraced them with relief. They had had enough of tripe and kidneys. For them, offal was a symbol of hardship, something to be left in the past. For others, these dishes remained part of their culinary repertoire, a taste of their childhood. The famous British chef Fergus Henderson, a modern champion of nose-to-tail eating, is in many ways reviving a philosophy that was common practice for an entire generation. But we have to wonder, how did the widespread consumption of organs, some of which filter toxins from the body, affect public health in ways that were never measured at the time? Did the psychological act of preparing and eating things like a sheep's head create a lasting disconnect or a deeper connection with the food source? And how many regional, traditional recipes for using offal were rediscovered during this time, only to be forgotten again in the rush for convenience after the war? Number 12 was the government dictating what you ate for dinner. It's a strange thought. It's the government telling you not just what you could buy, but how you should cook it. Yet, during the Second World War, this is exactly what happened. Government ministries like Britain's Ministry of Food and the U.S. Office of War Information became the most influential cookbook authors and nutritionists in the country. Their goal was twofold: to manage the limited food supply and to keep the population healthy enough to work and fight. This was a massive, unprecedented experiment in national dietary management. The driving force behind this was Lord Woolton, the British Minister of Food from 1940 to 1943. He was a businessman, not a politician, and he brought a practical, marketing-savvy approach to the job. He understood that you couldn't just restrict food, you had to educate and persuade people. He enlisted an army of home economists, nutritionists, and advertising experts. They used every medium available: radio, newspapers, magazines, posters, and films. The BBC broadcast a daily radio show called The Kitchen Front, featuring speakers like Marguerite Patton, who gave practical advice and cheerful encouragement. The government's advice was based on the latest nutritional science. Scientists like Jack Drummond, the scientific advisor to the Ministry of Food, played a huge role. They knew the country was facing a shortage of calories, protein, and fats. They also knew they had a surplus of certain things like potatoes and carrots. So the messaging was clear: eat more potatoes, they provide energy, and vitamin C, eat your greens, grow your own food. Waste nothing, this advice was hammered home relentlessly. Posters showed healthy, smiling families eating plates piled high with vegetables. They didn't just give general advice, they provided specific recipes. The most famous of these is the Woolton pie, a dish Lord Woolton himself helped popularize. It was a pie made with potatoes, carrots, parsnips, and turnips, topped with a potato or wholemeal pastry. It was designed to be nutritious and to use only unrationed ingredients. While it became a symbol of wartime austerity and was joked about for its blandness, it represented the government's entire philosophy in a single dish. Another key policy was the introduction of the national loaf. This was a wholemeal bread, grayish in color, made from flour that used more of the wheat grain. It was less popular than white bread, but it was significantly more nutritious, containing more fiber and B vitamins. Its consumption was not optional. White bread was largely unavailable. This level of government intervention in the private lives of citizens was extraordinary. It shaped the daily meals of millions. The state was, in effect, the nation's dietitian. This approach, while intrusive, had a remarkable and measurable impact on public health, which we will explore further. It created a population that was highly educated about vitamins and nutrition, at least in the basic terms promoted by the government. Concepts like protective foods, fruits, vegetables became common knowledge, but this raises some unsettling questions. How much of the nutritional advice was pure science, and how much was simply a way to justify the available food supply? For instance, was the emphasis on carrots purely for vitamin A, or was it because carrots were one of the few things growing in abundance? Did this top-down dietary control create a generation that was more compliant with authority, or did it foster a hidden resentment that surfaced after the war? And what are the ethical implications of a government using propaganda, however well intentioned, to so directly control what its citizens eat? Rule number 11, did less food actually make people healthier? It is one of the great paradoxes of the 20th century. During a time of immense stress, hardship, and severe food shortages, the health of the British population improved. This counterintuitive fact has been studied by historians and epidemiologists for decades. The data is clear. From 1940 to 1945, infant mortality rates fell, the average height of children increased, and life expectancy rose. Most strikingly, deaths from heart disease and diabetes saw a significant decline. How was this possible? The answer lies in the nature of the ration diet. While it was monotonous and often unexciting, it was, from a nutritional standpoint, very well designed. The team of scientists advising the British Ministry of Food, including Jack Drummond, Elsie Widdowson, and Robert McCants, crafted the rationing system to ensure everyone received a baseline of essential nutrients. The diet was low in sugar, low in fat, and low in meat. It was high in carbohydrates from potatoes and the national loaf, and rich in vitamins from the abundance of vegetables grown in Victory Gardens. In essence, the government had inadvertently imposed a diet that a modern nutritionist might recommend. The sharp reduction in sugar and fat intake is believed to be a primary reason for the drop in cardiovascular disease. With butter, margarine, and lard heavily rationed, people's consumption of saturated fats plummeted. A 1976 study published in the journal The Lancet looked back at this period and linked the decline in mortality from heart attacks directly to these dietary changes. Similarly, with sugar so scarce, cases of type 2 diabetes and dental cavities decreased. The national loaf, with its high fiber content, also contributed to better digestive health. The government also focused on fortifying the food that was available. Margarine was fortified with vitamins A and D to make it nutritionally equivalent to butter, which was almost impossible to get. Calcium was added to the flour for the national loaf to prevent deficiencies. There was a particular focus on vulnerable groups. Pregnant women and young children received extra rations of milk, cod liver oil for vitamins A and D, and orange juice for vitamin C. This national nutritional safety net meant that, for the first time, the poorest segments of the population were guaranteed a diet that met their basic needs. In many cases, the ration diet was better than the nutrient-poor, high-sugar diet they had been able to afford before the war. This improvement in health was not universal, of course. The diet was calorie-restricted, and men engaged in heavy manual labor often struggled to get enough energy. The lack of variety was psychologically wearing, and the statistics, while positive overall, hide the individual stories of hunger and craving. But on a population level, the results were undeniable. The war, for all its horrors, acted as a large-scale public health intervention. It demonstrated that a simple, low-fat, low-sugar diet could have dramatic and rapid effects on the health of a nation. However, many unknowns persist. Were there other factors beyond diet that contributed to these health improvements, such as increased physical activity or a stronger sense of community purpose? What were the negative, unmeasured health impacts, such as stress-related illnesses or deficiencies in trace minerals not tracked by the government? And most critically, if the health benefits of such a diet were so clear, why did society abandon it so completely and rush towards processed, high-fat, high-sugar foods the moment the war was over? Number 10, what does a potato become when it's not just a side dish? The potato, a humble, common vegetable. But during the war, the potato was elevated to a position of national importance. It was no longer just a side dish to accompany a piece of meat. It became the main event, the foundation of the entire civilian diet. The government knew that potatoes were a lifeline. They are relatively easy to grow in large quantities, they store well, and they are packed with calories and vitamin C. They could fill the empty space on a plate left by the minuscule meat ration. So, the potato became the subject of a massive propaganda campaign. Potato Pete was a cartoon character created by the Ministry of Food. He appeared on posters and in films, singing songs about the virtues of the potato. The message was simple: eat more potatoes. They will help you win the war, and people listened. The consumption of potatoes in Britain nearly doubled during the war years. They were served at almost every meal, in every conceivable form: boiled, mashed, roasted in a tiny bit of dripping, fried. They were the dependable, filling, and most importantly, unrationed core of the diet. The creativity that was applied to the potatoes. Because flour was rationed, potatoes were often used as a substitute in baking. Mashed potatoes could be used to make pastry for a savory pie. Grated raw potato could be added to bread dough to stretch the flour ration and keep the loaf moist. There were recipes for potato cakes, potato scones, and even potato-based puddings. The mock dishes that became so famous often relied heavily on potatoes for their substance. A mock fish cake might be made from mashed potato and flavored with a precious tin of sardines or a bit of anchovy paste. The potato also became the main ingredient in one of the war's most iconic dishes, the Woolton pie. The pie's filling was almost entirely root vegetables, with potatoes providing the bulk. The crust itself was often made from a mix of wholemeal flour and mashed potato. This dish, more than any other, symbolized the central role of the potato. It was a complete meal, built around the starchy tuber. This reliance on a single crop had a profound effect on the nation's culinary landscape. It made the diet incredibly starchy and carbohydrate heavy. While this provided necessary calories for energy, it also led to a certain monotony. The phrase "and potatoes" could be added to almost any description of a wartime meal. The reliance on potatoes was a subject of many jokes, a way for people to cope with the dietary boredom. But behind the jokes was a real dependence. A bad potato harvest would have been a national disaster on a scale far greater than in peacetime. The entire food security of the nation rested on the success of the potato crop. But what did this potato-centric diet do to the nation's gut microbiome? We have no way of knowing how such a drastic long-term shift to a high-starch, low-protein diet affected digestive health in ways science, at the time, couldn't measure. How much did the perception of the potato as peasant food contribute to its rejection in favor of more sophisticated carbohydrates like pasta and white rice in the decades after the war? And did the constant promotion of a single food source create a blueprint for future public health campaigns for better or for worse? Number 9, if you couldn't buy it, could you find it in the wild? With so many foods rationed or simply unavailable, people began to look for sustenance in places they had previously ignored: the hedgerows, fields, and forests. Foraging, the act of gathering wild food, underwent a major revival. This wasn't a recreational activity. It was a practical way to supplement the meager rations with fresh flavors, vitamins, and a sense of abundance in a time of scarcity. The government and public organizations actively encouraged it. The Ministry of Food published pamphlets on how to identify and use wild plants. Groups like the Women's Institute organized foraging walks and demonstrations. This was a way to get free food, food that was off ration and available to anyone with the knowledge and the patience to look for it. It was a treasure hunt for calories and nutrients. Nettles were a common target. Usually considered a painful weed, young nettle tops were picked with gloves, of course, and boiled. They lose their sting when cooked and can be used like spinach. They are incredibly rich in iron and vitamins. Nettle soup became a common spring dish. Dandelion leaves were used in salads. Rose hips, the fruit of the rose plant, were a superstar of the foraging world. They were found to be an exceptionally rich source of vitamin C, containing many times more than oranges, which were impossible to get. The government organized a national collection of rose hips. Children were paid a few pence per pound to harvest them. These were then processed into a thick, sweet rosehip syrup, which was distributed to babies and young children to prevent scurvy. The search for food extended to all kinds of wild produce. People gathered wild garlic to add flavor to bland dishes. They picked mushrooms, though this was always risky and required expert knowledge. They harvested wild berries like blackberries and elderberries in the autumn. These were precious because they could be made into jam, a way to preserve a bit of sweetness for the winter months without using the sugar ration, which was often supplemented for jam making. Nuts, like hazelnuts and walnuts, were another valuable find, providing much-needed fat and protein. For those living on the coast, foraging meant gathering seaweed, which could be used in various dishes, or searching for shellfish like mussels and winkles. In the countryside, the line between foraging and poaching often blurred. A rabbit or a pigeon caught in a snare could provide a rare feast of fresh meat for a family. While illegal, it was a common practice that many local authorities turned a blind eye to. The writer and naturalist Brian V.C. Fitzgerald wrote about this period, documenting the surge in country knowledge and the importance of these willed foods to the rural diet. This return to foraging connected people with the natural world and with an older, almost forgotten knowledge of the land. It taught them to observe the seasons and to recognize the edible plants growing around them. It was a skill that had been largely lost with the rise of industrial food production. The war, in a way, forced its rediscovery, yet this raises some important questions. How many people became ill or were even poisoned from eating misidentified plants or fungi? There are no reliable statistics on this. Did this renewed interest in wild resources lead to overharvesting and long-term damage to local ecosystems? And as this generation passed away, how much of that hard-won practical knowledge of the natural larder was lost once again, leaving us more disconnected from our environment than ever before. Number 8. How did a simple queue change a neighborhood? The queue. It is one of the most enduring images of the home front during the Second World War. Lines of people, mostly women, waiting patiently outside a butcher, a baker, a grocer. The queue was a daily, or near daily, reality for millions. It was a direct consequence of rationing and scarcity. When a shop received a delivery of a sought-after item, a few pounds of sausages, a crate of tin fish, a rare shipment of onions, a queue would form instantly. And waiting in that line became a central part of the wartime experience. It was a source of immense frustration. A woman might spend hours of her day just standing in various queues, often to find that the item had run out just before she got to the front. The weather didn't matter. The queues were there in the rain, the snow, the cold. It was a huge drain on time and energy, especially for women who were also working in factories or managing a household and children. The uncertainty was stressful. You never knew what you would come home with at the end of the day. But the queue was also something more. It was a social hub of the neighborhood. It was where news and information were exchanged. Official news came from the radio and newspapers, but the real practical news came from the queue. Which shop was expecting a delivery of eggs? Had anyone heard a rumor about the bacon ration being cut? It was a highly efficient, informal information network. People shared tips, not just about shopping, but about everything. They shared recipes for how to cook the strange cuts of meat they managed to buy. They offered advice on how to make a powdered egg taste more like a real one. In the queue, social barriers were often broken down. Women from different classes and backgrounds stood together, united by a common purpose. They shared their worries about their husbands or sons at the front. They complained together about the latest government regulation. They watched each other's children. Lifelong friendships were forged in those lines. The historian Juliette Gardiner, in her book Wartime Britain 1939 and 1945, describes the queue as a complex social institution, a place of both solidarity and friction. Of course, it wasn't always harmonious. Queues could be places of tension and conflict. Accusations of queue jumping could lead to furious arguments. There was resentment towards those who seemed to have an insularity with the shopkeeper and got preferential treatment. The queue mentality became a part of the national psyche. The idea of waiting your turn, of fairness and order, was reinforced every single day. It was a microcosm of the national effort, a belief that if everyone followed the rules, everyone would get their fair share, however small that share might be. But what was the unrecorded psychological toll of spending so much of one's life waiting in line for basic necessities? How did the power dynamics within the queue, the gossip, the judgment, the social pressure, affect the mental health of women on the home front? And did the queue system, by making the acquisition of food so public, inadvertently, help to enforce the rationing system more effectively than any government inspector ever could? Number 7 was a mock duck made of lentils, an insult or an innovation. When the main ingredient of a meal is missing, what do? You invent a substitute. The wartime kitchen was a laboratory of culinary imitation. With meat, eggs, and cream either severely rationed or completely unavailable, cooks had to become masters of illusion. They created mock dishes, recipes designed to mimic the taste and texture of a desired food using only the ingredients they had. This was not about trickery. It was about satisfying a craving, about bringing a sense of normality and pleasure to a diet defined by restriction. Mock duck is one of the most famous examples. There were various recipes, but none of them contained any duck. A common version was made from lentils or sausage meat, if you could get it, packed into a savory shape with an onion and sage stuffing, and then roasted. It was an attempt to recreate the experience of a Sunday roast. Was it the same as real duck? Of course not. But it was a hot, savory, substantial meal that could be carved at the table, providing a psychological boost as much as a nutritional one. The creativity didn't stop there. Mock cream was a household staple. With real cream impossible to get, people made a substitute by whisking together margarine, milk, or milk powder and water, and a little sugar and corn flour. It didn't taste exactly like cream, but it could be spooned over a stewed fruit pudding, adding a touch of richness. There was mock marzipan, made not from almonds, but from mashed haricot beans and almond essence. It was used to top the occasional celebration cake. Eggs were a particularly difficult item to replace. The ration was often one fresh egg per person per week. The government introduced dried egg powder, imported from the United States. While useful, it had a distinct flavor and a rubbery texture when scrambled. So, cooks found other ways to bind their cakes and puddings. Mashed potato was a common binder. So was a paste made from flour and water. The results were often heavy and dense, a world away from a light, fluffy sponge cake, but they were better than nothing. This culinary inventiveness was championed by the Ministry of Food and by wartime food writers. They presented these recipes as a fun challenge, a way to outsmart the shortages. It was a form of domestic defiance. They were refusing to let the war ruin their meal times entirely. The recipes were shared in magazines and on the radio. Women exchanged their own variations in the shopping queue. This collective effort to make something out of nothing was a testament to human ingenuity in the face of adversity. The food historian Leah Lenneman has explored how these recipes were a crucial part of maintaining morale on the home front. But this raises some interesting questions about authenticity and perception. Did eating a mock version of a beloved food just make people miss the real thing even more? What did these substitute ingredients used in such unusual ways do to the long-term health and digestion of the population? And how many of these mock recipes were genuinely enjoyed, and how many were simply endured as a grim necessity of war, only to be happily discarded and forgotten the moment real ingredients became available again? Number 6, did sharing recipes become a form of resistance? In a world controlled by ration books and government directives, the simple act of sharing a recipe took on a new meaning. It was more than just an exchange of cooking instructions. It was a grassroots movement, a way for people, mostly women, to share knowledge, build community, and assert a small measure of control over their domestic lives. This informal network of recipe sharing was a vital supplement to the official advice coming from the government. Official recipes, like the ones for Walton pie, were often practical but uninspired. They were designed for nutrition and efficiency. But the recipes that women shared among themselves were different. They were about making the monotonous diet more palatable. They were about small tricks and clever substitutions, how to make a cake with no eggs that didn't taste like a brick, how to make a savory pudding out of stale bread and leftover vegetables, how to use a bit of spice, if you could find it, to liven up a bland stew. This was a folk wisdom passed from neighbor to neighbor, over the garden fence, or in the queue at the grocer's. The women's magazines became a key battleground in this culinary war. They published the official Ministry of Food recipes, but they also ran columns where readers could send in their own tips and recipes. These columns were incredibly popular. They were a space where women could share their own discoveries and innovations. A reader might write in with a tip for making a mock cream that didn't taste so much like margarine, or a method for roasting potatoes that got them crispy with only a tiny smear of fat. These were small victories, but they mattered. They made life a little more bearable. The Women's Institute in Britain was another crucial hub for this knowledge exchange. Local WI groups held meetings and demonstrations on wartime cooking and preserving. They compiled their own recipe books filled with member-submitted recipes that were tested and proven to work with the available rations. These recipe books, often simple, typewritten pamphlets, are now valuable historical documents. They show the incredible ingenuity of ordinary women. They contain recipes for things that sound strange to us today, like carrot jam and parsnip bananas. This collective problem-solving was a form of quiet resistance. It was a refusal to be defeated by scarcity. This recipe sharing also had a psychological function. Cooking was one of the few areas where women could exercise creativity and skill. A successful dish made from next to nothing was a source of pride. It was a way of caring for one's family, of providing comfort and a sense of normality in a world of chaos and fear. The act of writing down a recipe and passing it to a friend was an act of solidarity. It said, "We are in this together, and here is something that might help." The food writer and cookery expert Marguerite Patton, who broadcast to millions, was successful because she understood this. She spoke not as a government official, but as one woman sharing her knowledge with another. But what do we not know about this hidden network? How many of these recipes, passed on by word of mouth, were lost forever? Did the reliance on shared, often unwritten, knowledge create a divide between those who were part of a community network and those who were isolated? And to what extent did this focus on domestic ingenuity reinforce traditional gender roles, even as women were taking on new responsibilities in the workforce? Number 5, when jars were gold, how did anyone preserve the harvest? The Victory Garden was a triumph of production, But growing the food was only half the battle. The other, equally important challenge was making it last. A glut of beans in August was wonderful, but it wouldn't feed you in February. With fresh fruit and vegetables unavailable for much of the year, and tinned goods heavily rationed, preserving the harvest became an essential skill for every household. It was a race against time and rot. Canning, or bottling as it was more commonly known in Britain, was the primary method. But it was not easy. The equipment could be hard to come by. Glass jars were reused year after year, treated like precious heirlooms. The rubber seals needed for an airtight closure were particularly scarce. People had to be incredibly careful to ensure a proper seal, as a failed jar could mean wasted food and, in rare cases, the risk of botulism. The government and organizations like the Women's Institute set up community canning centers where people could bring their produce to be preserved using shared large-scale equipment. Jam making was another national obsession. The government recognized its importance for preserving fruit and for morale, so they would occasionally issue extra rations of sugar specifically for this purpose. People made jam from anything they could grow or forage: rhubarb, plums, blackberries, even marrows and carrots. A well-stocked pantry of homemade jam was a source of immense pride and security. It was a splash of sweetness and color in the gray winter months. Pickling was also a popular method for preserving vegetables. Onions, cabbages to make sauerkraut, and beetroots were commonly pickled in vinegar. This not only preserved them, but also added a sharp, strong flavor to the often bland wartime diet. Salting was another ancient method that saw a revival. Runner beans, for example, were often layered with salt in large earthenware crocks. They would have to be soaked in water to remove the excess salt before being cooked, but it was an effective way to keep them for months. Drying was less common for vegetables, but was used for herbs. Every garden had a patch of herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme, which were carefully dried and stored to add flavor to winter stews. For those with a cool dark cellar, some root vegetables could be stored without any special processing. Potatoes, carrots, and turnips could be stored in boxes of sand or dry soil, which helped to keep them from shriveling or sprouting. This was all part of the annual rhythm of the wartime household, a frantic period of harvesting and preserving in the late summer and autumn, followed by the careful rationing of the stored goods throughout the winter and spring. This cycle, as described in many personal diaries from the period, like those compiled by the Mass Observation Project, was laborious but essential for survival. But what were the hidden dangers of this mass return to amateur food preservation? How many cases of food poisoning resulted from improperly canned goods? And were these incidents underreported due to the shame of having wasted precious food? The high salt content of many preserved foods had negative long-term health consequences that were masked by the overall positive effects of the wartime diet. And how did the immense labor involved in preserving, which fell almost entirely on women, add to their already significant wartime burden? Number 4, what secrets did the black market hold for the hungry? While most people abided by the rationing system, a parallel illegal food economy thrived in the shadows. The black market was a source of endless fascination, resentment, and temptation. It was a world of secret transactions, of something extra for those who had the money or the connections to get it. It was a direct challenge to the government's message of fair shares for all. The black market operated at every level. At the top were organized criminal gangs who would hijack food trucks or steal from warehouses. They dealt in large quantities of valuable goods like sugar, tea, and canned meat. But for most ordinary people, the black market was a much smaller, more local affair. It might be a farmer who sold a few eggs or a pound of butter on the side, without coupons for a high price. It might be a butcher who loased a few chops from a delivery and sold them to a favored customer. It might even be someone with a connection to an American army base who could get hold of things like chocolate, coffee, or tinned ham. Participation in the black market was a moral gray area, it was illegal, and the government ran campaigns with posters warning that the black marketeer is the enemy in our midst. It was seen as deeply unpatriotic, as undermining the collective sacrifice of the nation, yet for many the temptation was strong. For a family with a sick child who needed extra nourishment, or simply for someone desperate for a taste of a pre-war luxury, the black market was a powerful lure. People who used it often justified it to themselves, seeing it as a small transgression in a world of huge upheaval. The prices on the black market were exorbitant. A pound of tea could sell for 10 times its official price. A dozen eggs could cost a significant portion of a week's wages. This meant that the black market was, by its nature, unfair. It benefited the wealthy, who could afford to supplement their rations, while the poor had to make do. This created a great deal of social tension and resentment. People would whisper about the neighbors who always seemed to have a bit of extra butter, or who managed to produce a fancy cake for a birthday. The historian Mark Roothouse has written extensively on the black market, estimating that while it was widespread, it probably only accounted for a small percentage of the total food consumed, but had a disproportionately large psychological impact. Getting caught could have serious consequences, including heavy fines and even prison sentences. Newspapers were full of stories of black marketeers being prosecuted. This served as a deterrent, but it also added to the mystique of this underground economy. The black market wasn't just about food. It was about everything that was scarce: gasoline, clothing, cigarettes. But it was the trade in food that provoked the strongest emotions, because food was so fundamental to survival and morale. But there is so much we still don't know. How extensive was the black market really? Official records can only tell us about those who were caught, which was likely a tiny fraction of the total activity. How much did the existence of the black market act as a safety valve, preventing more widespread social unrest by allowing those with means to bypass the system? And what was the long-term impact on the social fabric of communities, where neighbors suspected each other of cheating the system that was supposed to bind them all together? Number 3, did a generation lose the taste for abundance? What happens to a child who grows up thinking that an orange is an exotic miracle, or that a single boiled sweet is a treat to be savored for an entire afternoon? The Second World War created a generation whose entire childhood was defined by food scarcity. For them, the ration book was as normal as a school book. The daily diet was predictable, repetitive, and devoid of most luxuries. This experience left a deep and lasting psychological imprint, shaping their attitudes towards food, waste, and consumption for the rest of their lives. For many of this generation, the frugal habits learned during the war became permanent. The "was not, want not" mantra was not just a wartime slogan, it became a core value. They continued to save leftovers, to use every part of a vegetable, to view throwing food away as something close to a sin. Even when food became plentiful again, they often struggled to shake the mindset of scarcity. Stories are common of grandparents who would meticulously clean their plates, save bits of string and foil, and have a pantry stocked with tinned goods, just in case. This wasn't just thriftiness, it was a deep-seated need for security, born from years of uncertainty. Their palate was also shaped by the wartime diet. They grew up on the savory, starchy flavors of potatoes, root vegetables, and wholemeal bread. They were not accustomed to intensely sweet or spicy foods. Many developed a lifelong preference for simple, plain cooking. For some, the taste of wartime staples like tripe or the grayish national loaf remained a source of nostalgic comfort. For others, it was a taste they were desperate to forget. The food writer and broadcaster Nigel Slater has often written about how this generation's cooking was influenced by this make-do ethos. This experience also created a profound appreciation for things that later generations would take for granted. An egg, a piece of butter, a piece of chocolate. These were not everyday items, they were luxuries. This generation remembered a time when these things were precious. This often led to a disconnect with their children and grandchildren, who grew up in an age of supermarkets and unprecedented abundance. The older generation could be bewildered and even angered by the casual wastefulness they saw in a society where food was cheap, plentiful, and disposable. However, the psychological impact was not entirely positive. For some, the constant anxiety about where the next meal was coming from and the pressure to be creative with limited ingredients left lasting scars. The monotony of the diet could be deeply depressing. The lack of choice, the endless queuing, the feeling of being constantly deprived, all of these took a toll. The end of rationing was met with widespread celebration, a signal that the years of hardship were finally over. But what were the deeper, unstudied psychological effects? Did the lack of variety in childhood diets affect sensory development or led to less adventurous eating habits in later life? How did the experience of being a child during rationing shape parenting styles around food for the next generation, leading to either strict frugality or a desire to overprovide? And did the shared national experience of a restricted diet create a unique generational identity that is now impossible for us to fully comprehend? Number 2, after years of scarcity, why did we run towards processed food? The end of the war did not mean the end of rationing. In Britain, it continued and in some cases became even stricter well into the 1950s. Bread, which hadn't been rationed during the war, was rationed in 1946. Meat rationing didn't end until 1954. But when the restrictions finally lifted, the reaction was not a return to the fresh whole food dig for victory diet that had made the nation healthier. Instead, society sprinted in the opposite direction towards convenience, processing, and industrial food. Why? The answer is complex, but a large part of it was psychological. The wartime diet, the wholemeal bread, the endless potatoes, the boiled vegetables, the mocking dishes, had become a symbol of hardship, austerity, and control. People were tired of it. They were tired of spending hours in the kitchen trying to make something out of nothing. They craved novelty, ease, and the foods they had been dreaming of for over a decade. White bread, sugary cakes, and fatty meat were not just food. They were symbols of freedom, prosperity, and the end of a long, dark period. The food industry was more than happy to provide them. The post-war era was a time of technological optimism. Science and industry had won the war, and now they were going to revolutionize the home. The kitchen was a key target. Food companies promoted a new vision of the modern housewife, liberated from the drudgery of cooking from scratch by a host of new products: cake mixes, instant puddings, frozen dinners, and tin spaghetti. These foods were marketed as modern, hygienic, and scientific. They represented progress. In contrast, the skills of the wartime kitchen type, baking your own bread, preserving vegetables, making stock from bones, were seen as old-fashioned and laborious. The supermarket began to replace the local grocer and butcher. It offered a dazzling array of choices, all under one roof. The pre-packaged branded goods promised consistency and safety. This was a stark contrast to the uncertainty of the ration queue. For a generation that had spent years worrying about where their next meal was coming from, the sight of fully stocked shelves was a powerful symbol of security and abundance. The historian Rachel Loudon, in her book Cuisine and Empire, argues that for most of history, people craved processed food because it was safer and more reliable than food in its natural state. The post-war boom was a dramatic expression of this desire. As a result, many of the skills that had been so vital during the war began to fade. This knowledge of how to grow vegetables, how to preserve, how to cook cheap cuts of meat was not passed on to the next generation. Why would you need to know how to bottle plums when you could buy a tin of them for a few pence? Why bake bread when you could buy a sliced white loaf that stayed fresh for a week? The war on waste was over, and a new era of convenience and disposability had begun. The unintended health benefits of the wartime diet were quickly reversed, as consumption of sugar, fat, and processed foods soared, leading to a rise in the very diseases that had declined during the war. But could this shift have been avoided? Was there a moment when, the positive lessons of the wartime diet, the focus on vegetables, the reduction in waste, could have been preserved and combined with post-war abundance? How much did the food industry's powerful marketing campaigns shape consumer desire versus simply responding to a pre-existing public craving for change? And is it possible that the very act of government mandated eating, however healthy, created a deep-seated psychological resistance to any kind of official dietary advice for generations to come? Number one is the war on waste, a battle we are still fighting. The generation that lived through the Second World War is now almost gone. Their direct memory of ration books, victory gardens, and Woolton pie is fading from our society. Yet, the legacy of that era and the questions it raises feel more relevant now than ever before. We live in an age of unprecedented food abundance, but we also face global challenges of food waste, climate change, and public health crises related to diet. The war on waste, fought in the 1940s, was a matter of national survival. Today, we are beginning to realize that we may be fighting a new war on waste for planetary survival. Consider the parallels. During the war, they used every part of the animal out of necessity. Today, the nose-to-tail and root-to-leaf movements are promoted by chefs and environmentalists as a way to reduce food waste and eat more sustainably. During the war, they turned lawns into vegetable plots to secure their food supply. Today, there is a growing movement for urban farming and community gardens to increase food security and reconnect people with their food. The government of the 1940s campaigned relentlessly against wasting food. Today, organizations like the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization report that roughly 1/3 of the food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted globally, and they are launching campaigns to change consumer behavior. The wartime diet, imposed by scarcity, was low in meat, sugar, and processed foods, and high in locally grown seasonal vegetables. This is remarkably similar to the diet now being recommended by many experts for both personal and planetary health. The lessons that the wartime generation learned through hardship are lessons we are now trying to relearn through choice. The difference is the motivation. For them, it was a collective, national effort driven by an immediate and obvious crisis. For us, the crisis is slower, more complex, and more abstract. The story of wartime eating is a powerful reminder that our food habits are not fixed. They can change dramatically in response to circumstances. An entire nation's diet was transformed in just a few years. It proves that large-scale change is possible, but it also serves as a warning. The moment the pressure was off, society rebounded, embracing the very habits of consumption and convenience that we are now trying to unlearn. The skills of frugality and resourcefulness, so carefully cultivated during the war, were quickly devalued and lost. Authors like Michael Pollan and journalists like Joanna Blithman constantly echo these themes, urging a return to a more mindful way of eating that has deep roots in this period of scarcity. So the final, most important questions are for us. Have we become so disconnected from our food that we have forgotten its true value? Can we learn the lessons of the war on waste without having to endure the hardship that taught them? And is it possible to build a food system that combines the resourcefulness and community spirit of the wartime generation with the choice and abundance of the modern world before a new crisis forces our hand once again?